Thanks very much to MDS UK Patient Support Group for inviting me to share some thoughts on coping with the diagnosis of MDS and the uncertainty it brings up for patients living with it, whether you're currently on treatment or not. As Zoya said, I'm the lead psychotherapist in the hematology department at King's College Hospital, fully embedded within the Hem-Onc, bone marrow failure, transplant, and cellular therapy team. I want to acknowledge something that I'm sure everyone's already mindful of at this meeting, that although all of you have something quite significant in common with each other, you might be at very different places psychologically or even physically in terms of how life's feeling for you at the moment. And so I'm going to share ideas that I hope will apply to the broadest range of people. So in whatever I say, take what's helpful and leave what isn't if it's not relevant to where you are right now. Because how somebody copes with MDS really has a lot to do with whether or not you're transfusion dependent or transfusion independent, whether you're under active monitoring or whether you're having treatments, whether you have had or are about to have intensive treatments like a stem cell transplant. All of this will influence how you're feeling and what's perfectly normal and understandable to feel as part of that coping. So the first thing to say is that distress in the form of worry, stress, anxiety, fear are all perfectly normal. Even if you've had the diagnosis for a while, it's possible that there'll be an increase in distress if something changes or at particular touch points just before your blood tests or bone marrow biopsies. Distress can take the point of low mood about the present, as well as fears or anxieties you might have about the future. Low mood or anxiety with the diagnosis of MDS can be about either what's happening right now, if you're experiencing poor quality of life right now, or about what might happen in the future, whether this is about needing intensive treatments or indeed concerns about your prognosis or fears about a shortened lifespan. And a natural process of adjustment, which includes an initial period of shock and quite heightened acute distress, followed by a reduction in this and an acceptance of a new routine, a new normal, naturally occurs for most people. I think if you're newly diagnosed and on this call today, it's important to understand that it'll take time for you to adjust and settle into this. And it's important not to force yourself or rush to feel okay about things. And that's where peer support networks like MDS UK really play a huge part, because you can interact with others who maybe they're a bit further along in the journey with MDS than you are, and you can get support or even a sense of hopefulness or optimism from other people living with the same condition. And just to acknowledge that those who are on active monitoring, there can be particular concerns about feeling like everything's changed, but materially nothing has changed. And this psychological gap can give rise to some distress in people who might not be having any treatments at the moment or might even be transfusion independent. So if you have a diagnosis of MDS, there are some myths and expectations about what healthy or helpful emotional coping looks like, which I want to try and dispel today. One is that I should just be grateful or happy if I'm currently okay, because things could be worse, that I need to be positive or strong all the time, that I should simply be able to move forward in my life with my goals or my aspirations, that I'm being negative by worrying about things getting worse, that such fears are abnormal or irrational because, quote unquote, there's no reason to feel like this, that I need to get rid of this fear in order to live my life, and that what's the point in having these feelings since I can't change the situation anyway. Now, all of these things written on the screen, in my view and experience, are completely false expectations. And step one for me in learning to cope with MDS or with any health condition is to recognize that you might be under the sway of some of these false myths. This promotes an acceptance. And what acceptance means to me in this context is recognizing that you may not be able to forget about the possibility of future progression or needing treatment, but it is possible to learn to live the best version of life that's available to you in spite of this fear. Acceptance of the situation necessarily requires us to accept how we feel about the situation as well. And I'm going to touch on a few strategies that can help coping with this overall uncertainty and situation. The first thing I want to talk about is self-compassion. Whenever you're experiencing a moment of distress, try asking yourselves, what would I say to a loved one, a family member, or a close friend if they were in this situation? We are all kinder to other people than we are to ourselves. And we all deserve kindness and compassion when we're having a vulnerable human moment. Asking yourselves this question helps you access a compassionate and wise voice. And then I honestly encourage you to do something that might feel awkward at the start, which is to practice saying what those words would be out loud to yourself in a kind and gentle tone. It can feel a bit strange when you start to talk to yourself out loud, but honestly, it's the simplest and most practical strategy to access that kind, compassionate, but also wise voice, which we're much easier to access when we're thinking about other people than when we're thinking about ourselves. And say the words to yourself that you need to hear in that moment. And this is really helpful when you're having a strong emotion or a thought that you can't fix or just kind of brush aside or make disappear. It really helps us be with strong emotions that might be present without forcing them away. The second is coping with uncertainty. Now, to me, as a psychotherapist trained in psychology, it's very important to understand why we dislike uncertainty in the first place. Our brains have evolved to constantly make assessments of the world and to keep us safe. So our mind is partly, its function is to constantly make assessments of risks and threats to us to avoid danger. And so we're constantly picking up on information and making decisions to keep ourselves safe. Now, whenever you have a serious illness of any kind, your brain is already in a heightened state of threat and fear. So it's going to be even more sensitive to information about possible risks. And it's going to work extra hard to prevent further dangers to you. So contrary to what most people think, the natural state of the mind isn't a calm, beautiful, still pond. It's actually a raging river where all kinds of messy thoughts, ideas, restlessness, problem solving, looking for risks, looking for problems, planning for the future is taking place all the time. Now, once we know this, does it sound strange to us that people might think, oh, better be careful, the disease might come back, or you might get worse? Or does it seem quite normal and in keeping with what the brain is there to do? Now, it's a real shame that I can't see people, because if anybody's nodding or shaking their heads, I can't see it. So actually, once we understand that the function of the brain is to look for problems to solve and keep us safe by risk assessing our lives all the time, it's not strange that when you're feeling well, actually, your brain is going to think about what if you're not well at some future point. That's actually quite normal, because that's your brain doing what it's designed to do. Now, I don't want to assume, but I would guess that for many of you, your initial diagnosis took you by surprise and caused you some distress that you had to adjust to quite rapidly, what this meant for you and your loved ones. Now, once you've had that kind of scary feeling, if you come through to the other side and you achieve some stability, it's actually completely rational for your mind to try and prepare you for this happening again, because it doesn't want you to experience that upset and shock that you had the first time. So I'm kind of helping people understand this so that for those of you who do find yourself thinking about things going bad again, it's actually quite rational that your mind would worry about that when things are okay. We are also, as human beings, we like to safeguard against any negative emotional states like regret. So we feel a pressure to make the right decision. And I'm using the word right in quotation marks here, given the limited time, autonomy, and choices we have as human beings. And to meet these goals, we go out searching for clues. We like to plan, we like to analyze, we like to weigh things up so that we know we're making the right decision for ourselves and the people we love. Now, when we're dealing with something that brings with it an uncertainty, there's a lack of information that guarantees what a right decision looks like. And the problem is that while we desire certainty and predictability, human lives are unpredictable. And when things are going well, we tend to notice this less, and we fall into the habit of thinking that things are in our control. But the fact is that some element of random chance and unpredictability has always been there in your life and will always be there in our lives. And this sense of unpredictability is, of course, heightened when you're dealing with a serious illness as well. And again, this is me just offering a bit of education to understand that this is why all of these feelings we have about uncertainty are quite normal and where that comes from. So what do we do with that? So no matter what stage of disease you're in my experience, it's about trying to find a balance between planning and taking calculated risks or hoping for the best. For most people, adjustment to a diagnosis or an illness is about having good information or facts. But everybody's also different in how much they want to know. Some people want to know the details of the disease, treatments, what's down the road if it's needed. Others don't want to know too much. And neither of these is right or wrong. All of you, I'm sure, rely on your treating teams to provide you with that information to support your coping. And that's actually the basic layer of coping with any health condition, is to have accurate information about it. The difficulty is there are questions your team might not be able to answer. And here's where we need to find ways of being okay with uncertainty. Now, the thing is, our minds can time travel, but we can only influence events in the present moment. When it comes to big questions about what could happen, often in a state of anxiety, we ask a lot of questions, but what we don't do is to try and engage with them or answer them. So to give you an example, if you're having the thought, what if I go on holiday and get sick while I'm there? This is a common what if somebody might have who's got a health condition. If you ask this question and leave it unanswered, you don't give yourself the chance to see that you can problem solve it. And instead ask yourself, try and confront the question your mind is posing, however scary that might be. Ask yourself, what would I do if that happened? And you'll find that you will be able to generate an answer to that question. So part of living with uncertainty is to try and engage and confront with those what if questions that the mind will naturally generate. If it's a future worry, ask yourself, what can I do about it right now, tomorrow, or next week? What can I do about it in the short term? If you can think of things you can do in the present to prepare for the future, you should look to doing them, because that'll give your mind some peace because you've made a plan. Writing them down, set an intention to put them into action, all of these things can help. Even if it means painful things, because it might mean things like, sorting out your financial affairs or doing things like that. But again, this is about planning for what the mind is scared about while hoping for the best and striking a balance between them. And generally, after we've planned to the extent that it's possible, it's absolutely okay to step into the unknown, hoping for the best. Every human being has to do this. This is a type of acting as if it will be okay. That helps us to put one foot in front of the other in the present, which is actually the only time frame in which our life is actually being lived. And actually, we do this all the time as human beings without even realizing it. If you've got uncertainty about side effects, and when you might feel better again, if you're having poor quality of life from the side effects, this can, of course, be helped by getting advice from your medical team. They might be able to guide you as to how long you can expect certain changes to last or to generate an accurate picture. It can also help you to reframe a negative conclusion, like I'll never get better, to a more balanced or proportionate perspective that, I don't know when I'll feel better. What's happening isn't my fault. I can only do my best. This can give you that kind of psychological flexibility to make the most of the now, if you can. And it goes back to what I was saying earlier about accepting your emotions instead of trying to push them away. So, for example, I'm feeling down because I want to do this, but I can't do it. That's okay. Just acknowledge that to yourself, validate your own feelings. It can often feel difficult to go back to a sense of innocence or trust after getting any serious diagnosis, in this case, the diagnosis of MDS. Part of living with fear of disease progression or uncertainty is to learn from experience and prepare for what you can prepare for. Like I said before, if you're able to think about a future concern and make a plan to help deal with it, by all means do so. But after that, it's also about trusting yourself and your capacity to adapt. When we anticipate future problems or dangers, most of us overestimate threat and underestimate coping. So it's this imbalance that gives rise to anxiety. Anxiety by default in any of us makes us overestimate risk and threat and underestimate coping. So, when we, for example, if I were to ask anybody to imagine in a year's time, you're going to get this diagnosis, majority of people's impulsive response would be, I couldn't possibly cope with that. And yet we know that people all over the world are getting diagnoses of health conditions all the time and do find a way to cope with it. Life has put us all in situations where we have to find our feet without prior notice, without knowing what was going to happen. I truly believe that all of you on this call have already risen to an unexpected challenge that came your way from the diagnosis. And you are all much more resilient than you might realize when you're anticipating a future threat. So it's really important to recognize how adaptive you naturally already are. The other thing is that the human mind is really good at telling a story, and we can get completely hooked into believing it's true and that it's already happening. So when we have frightening thoughts about the future, we can actually experience the emotions related to that thought as if what we fear has already happened. Now, there are tools we can use to try and take notice of the thought without getting swept up in it. So one technique that we teach people to kind of unhook themselves from unhelpful thoughts is to name the thought. So for example, if you're having the thought that I might get sicker, try and say to yourself, I'm having the thought that I might get sicker, or my mind is telling me that I might get sicker. Try and put some distance between you and what your mind is saying. This is actually quite an effective technique to unfuse, to unstick from fearful or unhelpful thoughts you might be having. Mindfulness techniques and meditations are all strategies to help us build this skill of observing what your mind is saying without getting caught up in it. And these days, there are lots of great apps. I've put the name of a few on the on the screen there, Headspace, Calm, that can help you practice, get into a mindfulness practice regularly. The next thing is, and again, like I said, I'm giving you lots of coping strategies, so don't have to remember all of them. Just take what's helpful, leave what isn't. And I think this is being recorded for you to view later on as well. Often our beliefs or our assumptions about a situation makes our distress worse than it needs to be, especially if they're very rigid beliefs like I need to know in order to cope, or I need to plan, I need to be in control to be okay, I have to make the right decisions. But I mean, I'd invite everybody to gently be curious about whether these assumptions are actually true. And can you think back to any time in your life when you didn't know something in advance and had to deal with it and adapt when it happened in the moment? So what we can do with these beliefs, again, I'm not suggesting you have to get rid of them, because actually one of the hardest things to do is get rid of a thought. What we can do with these beliefs is we can try to reframe them into slightly gentler, softer, and more realistic versions that support coping with uncertainty. So on the right side of the screen are versions of the same thought, but I've just softened them slightly and taken some of the hard edges off. So from I need to know in order to cope, what about saying to yourself, not knowing is uncomfortable, but I can try and work with what I know so far. I need to plan. I'll plan as much as I can, and I'll deal with the rest as it happens. I need to be in control for things to be okay. Maybe tell yourself I can figure things out as they happen because I've done that before, and I can be okay even if things don't feel in my control. I have to make the right decisions. You might say there's no perfect answer or decision. I can only make a decision based on the information I have right now. All of this can help us stay in that kind of rational, proportionate thinking rather than very rigid black or white thinking. Next is this idea that, if we consider the fact that distress can be about the past or the present or the future, we can try and shift what we are paying attention to at any given moment. So we might not be able to change the situation we're in, but we can change. If we think about attention as a spotlight or like a lamp that we can move around, we can practice what we call attentional control. For example, if you're upset about how things are right now, for instance, say you're having a hospital admission or you're going through some temporary discomfort, reminding yourself that it won't be like this forever is helpful. That's where actually thinking about a future can help lift your mood in the present. Similarly, if you're anxious and worried about the future being worse than the present, remind yourself you're not living that. So that's where you might want to turn that spotlight to where things are right now, so that you're paying attention to what feels comfortable. Bring your mind back to the present if it's gone too far into the future. You might also say to yourself in a kind voice, I'm having all these thoughts about the future, but right now, nothing's changed. At this moment, I'm doing okay. Obviously, if that's true for you. The other thing we can do to kind of tolerate feelings of anxiety or that fight or flight feeling where we're heart's beating a bit faster, we've got butterflies in the stomach, is practicing simple breathing techniques. So learning to take just a very simple one that's easily accessible is breathe in for a count of 5, breathe out for a count of 10. So slow down your inhale and your exhale. Because again, even if you can't control physical symptoms of anxiety or stress, you can control your breathing. And it's the easiest way in to try and tell your nervous system, it's okay to slow down. Breathe in for a count of 5, exhale slowly for a count of 10. It'll also give your mind something to focus on, which is the other thing that helps in moments of anxiety. On the screen there, it says, find the small certainties within the larger uncertainties. So what I mean by that is remind yourself what is in your hands. Might be really small stuff when the big questions feel uncertain. Patients and loved ones experience so much powerlessness and loss of control during the course of diagnosis and treatment, right? That we can start to feel like absolutely nothing is within my power to influence. It can be helpful to remind yourselves that while big questions about survival, remission, relapse are not in your hands, small things might be. What can I influence in the here and now? I can't answer that big question, but what do I know for certain right now in this moment? It can even be really small things like what are you doing this evening, or what you're going to have for dinner, or how do you want to spend your time? Who do you want to call? Right now, I don't know anything else, but I know I want to call and speak to my sister or my brother or my friend. When your mind becomes stuck on what's going to happen, try asking yourself, what do I know now? What do I have right now? And how do I want to honor and invest in what's present right now? What's important to me right now? This gives the mind something quite clear to hold on to, and it gives you a direction of travel for the immediate future when you're feeling overwhelmed by big uncertainties. If there's something you can introduce into your life that's stable, that's predictable, that has a sense of routine, however small this activity might be, this can also help. These may all seem like really small things, but actually, if you think about it, what I'm talking about is the brick and mortar of what your daily life actually looks like. I don't know how it's going to be at the hospital tomorrow, but I know I'm going to go for a walk right now. That's what I mean. That's the kind of attentional shift I'm suggesting. And finally, if you are struggling a lot, this is just a slide kind of reiterating where you can get help. Naturally, if your care is primarily under King's and you're managed extensively by us, but there is a psychotherapy service at King's you can access. You can also look at NHS talking therapies in your area, where if you just put in the borough where you live and put in NHS talking therapies, you can self-refer. It used to be by GP referral, but now any patient can self-refer. And they are really the largest national provider of support for symptoms of anxiety and depression and low mood. And some of them have specific pathways for people with long-term health conditions as well. You might look at charities or voluntary organizations in your area that offer low cost or free counseling. What I want to say, though, is that not everyone needs to see a psychologist or psychotherapist. Even for all the patients under King's, we see only a small proportion of people with a diagnosis of MDS, because I'd say that majority of people use a variety of their own coping resources, relying on friends or family, relying on patient support groups or peer support groups to try and get through. Majority of patients with MDS are not having kind of acute, persistent mental health problems. And a majority of the time, what you're going through is an adjustment reaction to a difficult situation. And support from others in a similar situation, I mean, I can't overemphasize how much people value that. I mean, I even prescribe it to people who might be having therapy with me or somebody in my team as well, because there's just something very different about hearing from someone who's been in the same situation that you are in now.